I would like to talk about the top 5 franchises that I would love to see Larian Studios tackle after this massive success with Baldur's Gate 3. So I started playing Baldur's Gate 3 when it finally came out on the Xbox because I'm one of those poor blokes that couldn't afford a PlayStation 5 and my PC is about 3 years old and couldn't run it at all. So I had to wait very, very patiently, and then when my wait was over, we had that dreaded save file problem that happened. I was looking at the reviews of the game on the Xbox, and half of the reviews were saying, my file got erased, 0 or 1 star, Larian, please fix this. And I played it anyways. I was freaked out the whole time, and I just couldn't stop playing it. That's how good it was. Like, even with the risk of losing my entire file looming over my head, I could not stop playing this game. It was one of the most impressive things I've ever seen. It was worth the risk of losing 60 hours of gameplay, because I'd say, I'll just do it again. That's what kind of game it is. That's how blown away I was by this experience. So the question has to be asked, what is next for Larian? They just made this game out of nowhere and said, alright, peace. We're not making a Baldur's Gate 4. Which is fine, honestly. So it has been confirmed that Larian is working on a new game. Sven himself took to Twitter and said, "Been a great morning. After 4 months of rewriting and abandoning ideas and then revisiting them, finally figured out what Act 1 on this thing I've been working on needs to be. Quote me when it's revealed to see how much of today's draft survives. I suspect a lot." It got me thinking, I would absolutely love to see them work on these 5 different franchises that I'm going to list out right now. Now, just to be clear, I want to point out that I don't actually expect that Larian will make any of these games a reality. I'm just saying I wish that a studio with as much passion and talent as Larian would get involved with making a game, like from these franchises that I'm suggesting. That's all. Starting with number 5, Starfinder. Now, there is a reason I picked Starfinder over the more obvious choice, Pathfinder, is because Starfinder is like Pathfinder, but in space. Now, Larian Studios just finished working on a high fantasy game set in the Dungeons & Dragons world, and I think that doing that again with Pathfinder would be a little redundant. There'd be too many comparisons made between the two properties. Because Pathfinder is derivative of Dungeons & Dragons, there isn't much reason to do it again, if that makes sense. But with a similar system and a less corporation, Paizo, Starfinder is ideal for the experience and the abilities of the team that worked on Baldur's Gate 3. One of the other reasons why Starfinder would be great is because it already works on the dice system that Dungeons & Dragons and Baldur's Gate 3 functions on. You'd still have those nice little dice rolls to see if your checks work out, and that would always be a very welcome addition, because I love that little bit of chance that goes into it, whether you might succeed or fail, and Starfinder keeps that mechanic alive. It also adds space exploration. It has different races, it has different classes, it also has different kinds of ships that you can make. So that's another new mechanic that you could add on top of it. Ships that could go from planet to planet or from area to area, as you might want to call them. Starfinder also does have a preset setting that Larian could adapt into their own story. It also can function on a grid just like Baldur's Gate 3. And it would just adapt right into that world, but there's also a lot more freedom that Larian would have with the project because it's owned by Paizo and not by a mega corporation like Hasbro. So essentially, just picture it now, Baldur's Gate 3, but in space! In space! And that's why it would work, is because it is a free-to-use system that doesn't have a set canon that has to be followed rigidly based on the whims of a mega corporation. With those closing statements, moving on to number 4 on our list. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Between the years of 1993 and 2005, Star Wars was probably one of the most important franchises in gaming, which is strange to say because it's not particularly seen as a gaming franchise, more seen as a movie franchise. But they made so many innovative and creative and frankly awesome games. It's such a big deal that when LucasArts was closed after the Disney purchase of Star Wars, it's a travesty that could be equated with Microsoft buying Rare. Suffice to say, Star Wars and video games were intertwined. The KOTOR games were massive and successful, and just look at these ratings. It's hard to argue against success like that. But what happened to Star Wars video games after that? We got the Battlefront games, we got the Force Unleashed games. The last time Star Wars was involved in making an RPG was in 2011, and that was with the MMORPG, The Old Republic. The last time they made a single-player focused RPG was in 2004 with the release of Knights of the Old Republic 2. They haven't touched RPGs since, except for those cheesy little mobile games that sometimes people play. Why do I keep bringing up Knights of the Old Republic in this discussion? Because it's what Star Wars needs to do again. One of the things that made Knights of the Old Republic so successful among Star Wars fans is that the genre just works so well for it. When you're designing an RPG, you're designing an adventure intended to be taken by multiple people. At least most RPGs are designed that way. That's what the original Baldur's Gate games did. That's what Knights of the Old Republic did. Some of the only times you ever see, characters in Star Wars going off on their own, things go horribly wrong. One of the things that makes Knights of the Old Republic so special in the Star Wars franchise is because you feel like you're kind of in a Star Wars adventure. There's so many different possibilities that players could be able to choose from. And it would make the custom character part of it amazing, especially with a modern engine that could actually process that amount of information. Just look at Baldur's Gate 3, look at Divinity the Original Sin 2, look at what you are capable of doing in turn-based combat. So my proposal would honestly be just make a new Knights of the Old Republic and use Larian as the blueprint. We need a new Knights of the Old Republic game. We need a game where you can pick your own race of character to play as and go on an adventure becoming a Jedi, but having allies like bounty hunters, smugglers, droids, anything. I would love to have another crew feel like they're part of my crew. Not like in Jedi Survivor or Jedi Fallen Order, where the crew mostly just stays on the ship. Or they'll be involved in cutscenes, or maybe they'll walk you to a location. I want a game where the smuggler goes with me and shoots at things like Han Solo does in the movies. Now, I want a game where I have a droid like R2-D2 who can hack into consoles for me. I want a game that makes me feel like I'm not taking an adventure alone through the Star Wars galaxy. You can go from planet to planet to planet. Look at the way that Baldur's Gate is arranged. You have 3 acts with several different areas that you as the player can explore. Each area has 2 large maps to go through. And in Star Wars, just imagine the possibility. Star Wars just fits so perfectly. And a Knights of the Old Republic style game with modern mechanics, Larian style passion and talent, you're going to have an absolute masterpiece on your hands if you can get it right. And it's precisely what Star Wars is missing today. I think it's high time that Star Wars kicks it into gear, hires Larian or a studio with as much passion and talent as Larian's, give them practically no oversight, just let them do what they're going to do. See what comes out the other end. Moving on to number 3. The world has changed. Let's just get to it. Lord of the Rings, obviously, is a great choice for any RPG studio to make a game. Lord of the Rings is like the foundation of all modern fantasy writing. Without it, you wouldn't have Brandon Sanderson, you wouldn't have the Witcher series, you wouldn't have the Song of Ice and Fire series, you wouldn't have any of these series existing in the same way that they do today. Maybe these writers would have written different things, I don't know, but it would not look the same without the granddaddy Lord of the Rings. Dungeons & Dragons itself was heavily inspired by Lord of the Rings, by Tolkien's work. And Dungeons & Dragons is seen by most to be the foundation of modern RPG games. And Dungeons & Dragons, of course, is what Baldur's Gate 3 was based on. Now, how poetic would it be for the whole thing to come full circle? From Lord of the Rings, to Dungeons & Dragons, to Baldur's Gate 3, back to Lord of the Rings. Complete circle. Now, my main argument for why I would want to see Larian make a Lord of the Rings game is simply because it is an untapped gold mine. We have a dozen different fantasy races, a dozen different classes that they can play as. Not to mention the magic system isn't well defined, so there's so much freedom that the creators of the game would have to develop the magic system in that world. And here's the thing. I don't want another studio handling it who isn't up to the task. Look what happens to Lord of the Rings, one of the most perfect franchises ever, when all you do is throw money at it instead of passion and talent. Lord of the Rings doesn't deserve that. It deserves nothing less than the best. Lord of the Rings and video games have a complicated history. Recently, the most successful games set in Middle-earth were the Shadows of Mordor games, which, honestly, they have a very odd place in the Lord of the Rings because they're the only adventure that has a solo adventurer. Well, a solo adventurer, if you count Celebrimbor as a partner instead of being part of your character. It's very odd in that way in Middle-earth because The Hobbit takes place with a group. The Lord of the Rings takes place among several different groups of people. And it's just interesting to see how this franchise has not had an adventure game where you do have partners traveling with you to assist you, other than the movie-based games that were released 20 years ago. And the reason I say that Larian should be the one involved in making it is because they have passion, they have drive, they know what they're doing, they know how to do research, they know how to work with people who will tell them this is what's okay, this is what's not. They're very good at working with those guidelines in mind. Now, the only tricky part that I can really see is developing mechanics for it, because Lord of the Rings doesn't have pre-built mechanics that they could draw on, like Dungeons & Dragons, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. It doesn't have that. They'd have to make it up as they go along. So the mechanics would be very tricky to work out in a Lord of the Rings game, but I'm sure under the talented hands of people like Larian, they'd come to it eventually. So all I'm saying is, I want this circle to come full circle. I want to see the fruits of Tolkien's labor being put into a labor of love for an RPG that is long overdue for the world after all these years. Well, with that segue, moving on to number 2. Water, earth, fire, air. Long ago, the 4 nations lived together in harmony, but then everything changed when every single video game they've ever made has absolutely sucked. They've never made a great Avatar: Last Airbender game. You know what? No. They've never even made a good Avatar: The Last Airbender game. Avatar: The Last Airbender is the most underutilized franchise of all time. Ever since the first series dropped, we have not reached that level of quality ever since. Not with The Legend of Korra, not with the comic books, not with the books, not with the live-action adaptations, not with anything. It has never reached that high again. And the video games are just the worst aspect of it. There is a list of games that Nickelodeon has made for Avatar: The Last Airbender, and let me tell you, it's not an impressive list. There's been like 3 or 4 console games that have released on console and PC. There's like a dozen or 2 dozen Nick.com games that kind of fall into the mix, but nobody wants to see that, you know, when you're talking about video games. I mean, not to say that these old games are terrible, but just check it out. I mean, it's... they're like unplayable. It's like those movie-based video games, if you guys remember what I'm talking about, like where they would release a movie and then they release a video game based on the movie, basically just to say, hey, give us your money. Avatar's world and setting, it's just perfect. It's perfect for a video game. You have 4 major powers, you have a world that's at war.
And under the hood, a fuel-injected French fryer with dual overhead grease traps.
Whoa.
Yeah, wow.
In addition to the magic system that you have, they also have a setting that is almost entirely unexplored. Look at a map of the Avatar world. We've barely seen any of it. In Avatar: The Last Airbender, the series, and in Legend of Korra, we've only seen a couple dozen cities. Imagine playing a video game where you go from city to city to city. So all of this discussed, all of this on the table. Why Larian Studios for Avatar: The Last Airbender? Well, look at their past games. You have 4 companions going through an RPG adventure that's turn-based. The Avatar magic system very effectively complements RPG game mechanics as we know them. So you've got waterbenders that can heal. You've got earthbenders that can alter the landscape around them. You got firebenders who are just perfect for attack. And then you have airbenders who are just great for traveling around the map. Cheese the game! There's so many cheesing mechanics that you could use in Avatar. I love it. I love Avatar so much. The only issue that I can really see being a problem, they'd have to work with Nickelodeon. So that's why it's a franchise that I would want them to work on, but not something that I have faith that they actually could work on it. And following this, some honorable mentions. And for my number 1 pick, which may come as a surprise or not a surprise to people, War. War never changes. But it should. In 1997, the very first Fallout game was released. In 1998, the very first Baldur's Gate game was released. They were both CRPGs, or otherwise known as computer RPGs, ones that you would look top-down in an isometric view and be able to control your players using your mouse. Look at the screenshot of the first Fallout. Now look at the screenshot of the first Baldur's Gate. Very similar. Now look at the screenshot of Fallout 4, and now look at the screenshot of Baldur's Gate 3. There's a bit of a difference here that's going on now. Where Fallout went down the route of third-person, first-person shooter, but with RPG elements, Baldur's Gate retains the traditional RPG elements that made the series a success. That's not to say that the new Fallout games are bad, or even that they've gone in the wrong direction. They just went in a completely different direction. They are not familiar games to people that grew up playing the original 2 games. Now to explain that went along with the purchase of Fallout by Bethesda from its original creators. Previous to Fallout 3, the games that Bethesda was known for was Morrowind and Oblivion, which, look how they look at how Fallout 3 looks, and you'll see the similarities there, and why Bethesda chose to go that direction versus the old CRPG route that Fallout had become known for. Frankly, they're pretty much only similar with aesthetics. The mechanics are completely different. The way that companions can travel with you is different. They basically remodeled the entire game to function like their previous Elder Scrolls games, which I'm not going to fault them for that. That's much easier to do, especially if you just bought a franchise, you have a team that you're already using, and you need that team to develop the game. But here's one of the reasons I say, let's return to formula with Fallout. Look at Bethesda's development schedule. Todd Howard himself said that they aren't even working on Fallout 5 yet. They're working on Elder Scrolls 6. And following Elder Scrolls 6, they're going to start developing Fallout 5. It took them almost 7 years from the release of Fallout 4 to Starfield. That would mean that Fallout 5 could be 10 years away, 15 years away. For the love of everything that is good, Bethesda should just let another team handle it. And I would say, what better team than a team like Larian? One that excels at producing RPGs, one that knows how to keep the core mechanics from the original game and develop them for a modern audience. The one that works better than it used to in the past. One that did not create the franchise, but only paid honor to it. As we've constantly learned in the past couple of years of gaming, turn-based RPGs are not out. They are selling well, they are selling better than they ever have before. There's no reason for Bethesda not to take that risk with Fallout again, when the first 2 games were exactly that way, if not even slower than turn-based RPGs are now. In the hands of a great development team, they could take the tactical role-playing that they used to have, bring it back into the franchise, keep the same aesthetics, keep everything, and develop a new game that feels fresh, feels new, but also familiar to both the original Fallout 1 and 2 fans and the Fallout 3, New Vegas, and 4 fans. One of the other things that has made Fallout special over the years is the companions. In the very first 2 Fallout games, you could travel with as many companions as the game would allow. In the first game, you could travel with all of your companions at once, and the second game was only limited by your charisma score. Following that, Fallout 3, New Vegas, and 4 have only allowed you to travel with one human companion, and in 3 New Vegas, one animal companion as well. That limits how much interaction you actually get with all of your companions. In a game like Baldur's Gate, where your companions are constantly traveling with you, commenting on the surroundings, you get to know them so much better. You get to know their thoughts, their processes, what they want to do. You get to know just about everything there is to know about them until you're basically sick of them. It makes them feel more real. It makes them feel more involved in your story. They're not just set pieces, they're active participants in what you are doing. And the way that Larian developed that in Baldur's Gate 3, you could take that, implement it in Fallout, and you'd have the best characters that the series has ever created. Ones that feel necessary for your story, which is something that is missing from the previous 3 Fallout games. Not to mention the D&D-like mechanics that are already existent in the Fallout games. They would be very easy for a studio like Larian to transition into game mechanics. I'm not gonna lie, it would not be difficult. Honestly, with this one, I'm having a hard time coming up with any problems with letting a studio like Larian handle a franchise like Fallout, especially if the developers are fans of Fallout, like hardcore fans that know everything about the franchise and won't do anything to disrupt the status quo. All they'd have to do is make sure that they have someone on the team who can correct them if they're going astray, just like Larian was willing to do with Wizards of the Coast when they were developing Baldur's Gate 3. And that's the kind of work that you would need with Fallout. That's what would make it work. And it can. All they have to do is try. And it really helps that I don't want to wait another 14 years for a new Fallout game. That just sounds miserable. And that's it for my takes today. Those are my top 5 choices for franchises that I would love to see a studio like Larian adapt into an RPG. Alright, see you later.